afternoon's presentation, we have a keynote speaker who I originally met probably about 12, 13 years ago, perhaps, at a coffee shop in downtown Vancouver. And we sort of came together through some mutual connection anyway. I heard about this guy who wanted to do something more to do with mountain biking, and he worked for an engineering firm, and it wasn't really clear to me what it was, you know, so obviously I was a little bit skeptical. But as it turns out, you know, this dude is probably one of the most passionate guys when it comes to mountain biking and connecting people with the trails and to their and how trails can help in terms of connecting them with the land, their culture, and community. And anyway, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Patrick Lucas from the Indigenous Youth Mountain Bike Program.
So it's different doing this after 3 years. Like, I don't know, shouldn't you all be in like squares? You know, like some sort of dystopian Brady Bunch thing, or holiday squares, something like that, I don't know. I was almost tempted to come without pants on, because I figured maybe everybody would feel a little more comfortable, but I wore non-restrictive ones, so it feels a little more comfortable. So yeah, as Martin so eloquently said, I'm the founder and director of a program called the Indigenous Youth Mountain Bike Program. And so what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about how it all started and where it's come from and what's going on with reconciliation in the mountain bike community, and you know, have a bit of a talk about what are our responsibilities, our obligations in the era of reconciliation. And then immediately after that, we're going to have a panel, and I've got some wonderful people who've come out to join us and talk about these issues. So my first symposium was back in 2013 in Souk on the west side of Vancouver Island. And I had just kind of come into the mountain bike community at that time. I was really, really new, you know, and I was just sort of starting to get to a sense of what the community was like. I was that guy, like every group of friends who ride together, they have that guy who, you know, you all agree you're going to meet at the trailhead, and he comes ripping in 10 minutes late, totally disorganized, you know, like I'd park and open my door and my equipment would spill out, and I'd go to pick up my helmet and I'd kick it across the parking lot and have to chase, and all my friends are just staring at me like, dude, get it together. You know, and luckily I had so many good friends who kind of pulled me aside and said, you know, whenever you agree to meet at the trailhead, you know, there's an implicit agreement, there's an obligation that you're going to show up ready to go. You know, and now we're all waiting for you, but we'll wait because that's what we have to do, but you know, get your crap together. And so that was in my introduction to the mountain bike community. And as I came into it, there's so many wonderful people who showed me the way. Like guys like Martin, I'm seeing Kelly Sherbin in here, who taught me how to ride a little bit better. It's not your fault. You did the best you could. But all these wonderful people who showed me the way. And one of the things I immediately saw within the mountain bike community is that we're great storytellers. Not just in the sense that we can tell a great story about the ride we just did or that big drop that we went off, but I started to immediately learn the story that the mountain bike community tells about itself. And it's really informative. And it kind of was like this, you know, you think about the early days in, you know, California, or, you know, the emergence of the free ride movement on the North Shore. It was a story about these rough and rugged individuals carrying their bikes up into the mountains of the North Shore and then just throwing themselves down whatever they could. You know, they were like pioneers out in the forest. And it's a very powerful and compelling narrative. And I always found it really, really interesting. And particularly how it kind of mirrors the narrative that we tell ourselves about our country. You know, as settler Canadians, our people came over here 100 years ago and we found an empty land that we built up into this country. It's a very powerful and compelling narrative. And when I came into the mountain bike scene, that was kind of the predominant narrative at the time. And that when we came to Souk for the mountain bike tourism symposium at that time. And something happened leading up to that symposium that would change the trajectory of my career, and I think would ultimately have a huge impact on the mountain bike community. In the months leading up to that event, the Souk First Nation signed a pre-treaty settlement agreement for an area that included Broom Hill. If you've ever ridden in Broom Hill or ridden in Souk, it's a very popular mountain bike area, ironically named after an invasive weed that was introduced by one of the first settlers who came to BC, a guy named Walter Calhoun Grant. He planted broom, the Scottish broom, on his farm in the Souk area because it reminded him of his home, Scotland. You know, he was trying to kind of impose his idea of what the land should be like, and he wanted it to kind of look like what he knew as being familiar. And of course, you know, broom spreads everywhere. It's highly toxic, and it really takes root in disturbed areas, so along mountain bike trails or highways, that kind of thing, spreading all over the province. And when the announcement was made for this pre-treaty settlement agreement, there was kind of this moment within all of us who were organizing the symposium where we're like, what's going to happen now? Are we going to have access? That's always the question. Are we going to have access? Are we going to be able to ride? Is the First Nation going to, shut down those trails? And for me, I saw this was my opportunity. This was my opportunity to swoop in as like this guy who could build bridges between communities. I was going to save mountain biking. And so we reached out to Gordon Planis, a wonderful man, chief of the Souk First Nation. We tried to convince him to come and sit on the panel. And at first, he kind of really rebuffed us. You know, he would basically just say to us, "It's Broom Hill is our land. We're going to decide what's best for it. No, thank you. Please leave me alone." But I didn't leave him alone. We kept reaching out to him, and eventually he did agree to come and sit on the panel. And he delivered a very eloquent, very powerful talk about what that place meant to him. He told us that for them, they call it Sacred Mountain. It was a very important spiritual area for them. They had been fighting to get back for decades. And he told the audience, sure, some of you were there, he said, this place was like our church. It's where we went to pray, where we went to have our vision quest. Or it was, just imagine, like if we showed up to one day to your land, your community, and we built trails right through your graveyard or through your church, how would you feel? And I remember at that moment, the room was totally quiet, and everybody was listening. And one gentleman from the local bike club kind of stood up, and he's like, thank you so much for sharing what you told us today. Is it okay if we go ride your trails? And Gordon Planis kind of stopped. He's like, okay. and at that time, I thought that was amazing. I'm like, this is it. I didn't have a word for it then, but I would have called it reconciliation in action. And it was actually a while later that same guy who asked the question, he told me years later, he's like, I actually felt really bad about that because I felt like we put him on the spot. I mean, what was he going to say? No? And this really, for me, kind of captures a lot of what's happening in the mountain bike community. And when we're trying to work with and approach First Nations, it all comes down to how do we ask that? How do we gain that consent? How are we approaching those relationships? I felt watching Gordon and watching what's going on, I had this kind of vision in my head of seeing this happening all over the province. The treaty process was in full swing at this time. Land agreements were being signed all over the province. And I could see this happening over and over and over again. If we didn't get out in front of this issue, what was the future of mountain biking going to be? So again, in my mind, the savior, wannabe savior that I can be, I decided I was going to do something about this. And in a year or two before that, I had formed the Indigenous Youth Mountain Bike Program. So I spent basically the next year or so traveling all over the province, trying to pitch my idea to all these different First Nations about, we're going to create this mountain bike Shangri-La, this place where people will come together in a utopian ideal and we'll all ride together and it'll be all super happy and tra-la-la. And most of them would kind of look at me and nod, politely like, yeah, no thanks. And I couldn't understand at the time, I couldn't understand why they didn't see what I was trying to pitch to them. And it would be years later when I would finally start to understand what it was like for them to have this white guy coming in and telling them what was potentially good for their community. And so eventually I did start working with communities. I met guys like my best friend Thomas Schoen, who really taught me how to work with First Nations, and we started digging trails together. And it was out when I was working with them, down in the dirt, with my hands in the loam, the soil, working together, that they really started to open up to me. They started telling me about their people, about their history, and they would always be saying to me, it's like, you need to know your history. And I realized at the time I was doing the exact same thing I did when I first started getting into the mountain bike community. I was the guy showing up at the trailhead to work with First Nations, and not only was I disorganized, but I didn't even know the history of my country. I didn't know what had happened. I was completely ignorant about all the things that they were dealing with. So listening to them, they started telling me about, we started talking about things like terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery. And they say to me, how is it that your ancestors came here and declared that this land was empty? We've been here for thousands and thousands of years, but the crown, the British crown, decided that this land belonged to you. How did it come to be that way? And I learned about the Royal Proclamation of 1763. King George had just won the 7 Years' War, and they were worried about the American expansionism in the 13 colonies. So he basically declared all of North America west of the Appalachians as being in the domain of the crown. Like an epic land grab, unlike anything in history. Now, one of the key things that came from the proclamation, he said, that land belongs to the Indigenous peoples until the crown decides to negotiate with them for it. And only the crown can negotiate taking that land. And it's really important because that's what formed the foundation for all the treaties. The number of treaties all across Canada, the Douglas treaties on Vancouver Island, they were doing that under the auspices of the Royal Proclamation. And then what happened here in BC is basically the government started to get really concerned about American miners coming up in the 1850s and started conflict with the Indigenous folks and started forming their own ad hoc governance structures. And of course, the colony decided they couldn't have that, so they declared all of BC as being part of the colony without even so much as consulting with Indigenous peoples who had, governed themselves for tens of thousands of years. Another epic land grab. And that's the foundation of BC. That's the history that we need to understand. You go into Front Counter BC, or you go talk to your friendly neighborhood rec sites and trails officer, their authority to grant you the right to go out onto the trails is they've taken it from that fundamental, that theft of Indigenous land and asserting crown title to that land. Now, First Nations, never accepted that. They've always been fighting, and they've won court case after court case that establishes that truth. Right? So you have like the Delgamuukw case back in 1997. It was the court actually recognized, because of the Royal Proclamation, that the land was Indigenous and they had never ceded or surrendered their land to the crown. And that's why we have the modern treaty process. That's why all these things are going on. That's been backed up by the Chilcotin case in 2014. Again, it's saying these lands are unceded. So here in BC, you basically have, we talk about crown land, but the idea of crown land is based on a lie. So really in BC, what we have is you have two types of land. You have private land and you have unceded, unsurrendered Indigenous territory. And that's the reality. So whenever you go in, you go talk to a First Nation governance or a band administration, that's what they're thinking in the back of their mind is like, is this project going to undermine our rights and title, our claim to the land, or is this person going to work with us to uphold our rights and title? So as I continued working with those communities, I started to learn even more about the link between recreation and colonialism. I met my good friend Tom Eustache. He's going to be on the panel later, and it was working with him out in the woods, building trails together, that they started telling me about how they perceive recreation and the impacts on their land. We learned about the Oka crisis. This is in 1990. There was a small community municipality of Oka out west of Montreal, and they wanted to expand a development into a parcel of land that had long been claimed by the Mohawk people. It was land that was taken from them, it was expropriated, they were never compensated for it, and they were demanding to have it back. And the municipality recommended they wanted to expand a recreation development that was there. And the Mohawk decided they'd had enough. They put up a blockade, and it resulted in a 78-day siege with the Canadian military. A police officer was shot and killed. A Mohawk elder died when a rock thrown at a car smashed through the windshield and hit him in the chest. And this was all over the news. The whole country basically came to a standstill watching this unfold. That development that they were proposing was a golf course. How we play on the land, how we get out on the land is not neutral. You know, we think we're just going for a ride. We think we're just going for a hike. But every time we step out on the land, we are engaging in an explicit political act that is built on hundreds of years of history. And there's even more stories. Right here in BC, Sun Peaks. And I learned this from my friend Tom, and talking about his community, the Secwepemc people. This is in Secwepemc territory. And in the early 2000s, a Japanese company wanted to massively expand an existing little community ski hill and turn it into a massive resort. Then this Conlith people, who are related to my friend Tom, they adamantly opposed it. They set up a blockade, they set up a camp out on the land to oppose it, and the RCMP were brought in, people were arrested, assaulted, and some of them spent time in jail. And now Sun Peaks is a massive, highly popular, world-class destination, and just recently hosted Crankworks. How we play on the land is not neutral. Another story right here on Vancouver Island, where I now live, Bear Mountain. Back in the day, I think it was the early 2000s, there was like a former NHL hockey player who wanted to turn Bear Mountain into a massive development. And the local, I think it was the Malahat First Nation, opposed it, and they said that was a sacred area for us. There's a cave on the mountain that was used for ceremonies. They had an underground pool of water. It was really important to them. And they set up a blockade, and at one point, the cave actually got destroyed. In order to absolve the claim, the proponents of that development actually blew the cave up and then filled it with garbage. And now it's become a really popular mountain bike destination, and I believe the national mountain bike team, or however that works, trains there. How we play on the land is not neutral. How we approach it is not neutral. And the fundamental truth of our industry and our community is that it has been built on the erasure of Indigenous people and culture from the land. Whenever we go in, we get permits to build trails, or we engage with the government in that way, we have a question. We have a question that we need to ask ourselves. Are we going to perpetuate that system? Or are we going to stand with First Nations to disrupt the colonial system of recreation and build something different? And the good news is that it doesn't have to be that way. There's so many great examples of clubs and recreation groups that are coming together to do things in a good way. That's what all my First Nation friends and mentors and guides always would tell me. They have a phrase called working in a good way. And basically the idea is that whatever you do, however you approach an issue, as long as you come at it with an open heart and open mind and you're really listening to people, invariably the results will be better than if you weren't. And you can see examples of this all over the province. So one of my favorites, really recent, was the Ucluelet Mountain Bike Club, or a brand new club really here in BC. From the minute they initiated themselves as a club, they started reaching out to the Ucluelet First Nation. They really focused on building that relationship. They worked on it for over a year, and then they managed to sign an agreement where they would be able to build and maintain trails on Ucluelet treaty land. And my understanding is that's the first here in BC that involves treaty land in BC, where a club has gotten that kind of permission. And they took that right from the very first step that they took, is they knew they wanted to have that relationship, and they made it the centerpiece of what they were going to do. And now they're starting to build some, I think are going to be amazing trails. Or there's the Squamish Off-Road Cycling Association, who I've been following almost from the very beginning when I first started doing this work. They worked, I think for something like 15 years, they worked on developing a relationship with the Squamish First Nation. They took their kids out riding, they hired their kids as trail builders. They just really worked on that relationship, and they made it a priority. And just recently, they announced, they did a witnessing ceremony that they signed an agreement with the Squamish First Nation where they would be responsible for building and maintaining trails on their territories. And absolutely, it's a groundbreaking agreement and a perfect model, I think, of where we can go in the future. And there's a whole bunch of other clubs. Like one of my favorites is the Burns Lake folks are here. Love you guys. I remember 10 years ago meeting with them and talking about the First Nations in their area. And they made it a priority. They reached out to all the First Nations in the area where they have the trails on Board Mountain, the Lake Babine First Nation, the Burns Lake First Nations. They got the kids out riding the trails. They hire First Nation folks to work on the trail crew. And I remember one of the last times I was up there in 2019, I was driving up to the mountain in a rainstorm. It was just pissing rain. And there's 3 young Indigenous kids on their own bikes riding up the mountain to get there. And I can't stress to you how important that is. Like, I ride and I get to experience trails all over the province, but to create a space where Indigenous kids feel comfortable enough and welcome enough that they're going to ride out there on their own to ride those trails and that they feel at home on the trails in the territory, that's a huge achievement. And that's a great example of communities working together to make that happen. So there is a way to be on this land. There's a way to work with First Nations, and it really all comes down to how do we ask? And people are always asking me, it's like, how do you do it? Like, one of the things they say consistently is, I'm afraid of offending someone. And Tom and I are always joking about this, because I'm always saying, you will. You will. I mean, I know it. I'm like the awkward white guy who walks into all these communities, like, let's have a vision session. And I really kind of own being the awkward guy. It actually really works for me. Tom's community, the Shukwakan community, they always like to call me Samapui, which means really white. I'm like, okay, I'll take it. But that's the main thing, is you know things are going to happen. You're going to say something wrong. That's not the end of the world. That's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is, one, outsiders, or particularly white guys, who are so arrogant that they can't even conceive that they might do something wrong, and they never learn from it. But if you work with a community and you show them that you're willing to learn, that you're willing to open yourself up, and you're willing to try and do better, that's the most important piece. You just keep coming back. And I know Tom would say that that's basically what Patrick does. I just keep coming back. You know, like, and I think for Tom, it's like, okay, we have to work with Patrick because he's not going away. But that's the most important piece, is being a character, say you're going to do it, and keep coming back. And being accountable to what you say you're going to do. And that's the approach that you really need to take. So here we are, we're back at the trailhead. And I hope that we have at least a basic understanding of the key issues that we need to be thinking about moving forward.